I was 32 years old and working as a consulting agronomist in Portland when I received a call that would redirect the entire course of my life. It came from my former university professor, Dr. Margaret Hartwell, who had been more than just an instructor during my graduate studies. She'd been a mentor, a guide, and someone who truly understood my passion for sustainable agriculture and soil regeneration. Her voice on the phone carried an unusual weight, a mixture of excitement and concern that immediately caught my attention. "Daniel," she said, "I have a proposition for you, something that might sound crazy, but I think you're the only person I know who could make it work. There's an orchard property about 40 miles outside of Eugene, Oregon, 35 acres of apple trees that have been neglected for nearly a decade. The owner passed away, and his family is desperate to sell. The trees are diseased, the soil is depleted, and most people who've looked at it have recommended clearing everything and starting from scratch. But I walked the property last week, and I saw something there, potential that nobody else seems to recognize. I'd been feeling restless in my consulting work for months. I traveled constantly, writing reports and recommendations for large agricultural corporations that often ignored my suggestions about soil health and sustainable practices in favor of chemical-intensive shortcuts. The work paid well, but it felt hollow. I was advising others on how to nurture land, but I had no land of my own to care for. The idea of a challenging project, something that would require all my knowledge and skills, immediately appealed to me. Dr. Hartwell continued, explaining that the property was being sold at a fraction of its potential value because of its poor condition. The family wanted it gone quickly and were willing to negotiate with someone who had a genuine vision for restoration rather than development. She'd thought of me immediately because of my master's thesis on orchard soil regeneration and my passionate arguments in class about the importance of understanding root systems as the foundation of plant health. "How bad is it really?" I asked, trying to assess the scope of what I might be taking on. She paused before answering, and I could hear her choosing her words carefully. "It's bad, Daniel. The trees have fire blight, apple scab, and what looks like crown rot in at least 40% of the specimens. The irrigation system is broken. The soil tests show severe nutrient depletion and compaction. Any conventional agronomist would tell you to bulldoze it and walk away, but you're not a conventional agronomist. You see things others don't. You understand that sometimes the answer isn't in killing everything and starting over, but in understanding what went wrong and helping the system heal itself." Her words resonated with something deep in my core philosophy about agriculture. I'd always believed that plants, particularly trees, had an incredible capacity for recovery if given the right conditions. My thesis had focused on mycorrhizal relationships and how the fungal networks in soil could be regenerated to support tree health even in severely compromised systems. This orchard sounded like it could be a real-world laboratory for everything I'd studied, but never had the chance to implement fully. I drove out to see the property the following weekend. The moment I turned off the main highway onto the gravel road leading to the orchard, I could feel my heart rate increasing with a mixture of anticipation and anxiety. The entrance was overgrown with blackberry brambles and volunteer trees. The old wooden sign that once must have announced the orchard's name was weathered beyond reading, hanging by a single rusty chain. As I drove slowly down the access road, the full scope of the neglect became apparent. Row after row of apple trees stretched across the gently rolling hills, but instead of the orderly, vibrant appearance of a healthy orchard, I saw chaos and decline. Many trees had dead branches reaching skyward like skeletal fingers. Others were heavily laden with misshapen, diseased fruit that had never been harvested and now rotted on the ground beneath them. Weeds had grown waist-high between the rows, and I could see evidence of deer damage where animals had stripped bark from trunks during harsh winters. The irrigation lines that should have run along each row were broken in multiple places, with sections of pipe lying disconnected in the tall grass. It was honestly worse than I'd expected based on Dr. Hartwell's description. But as I walked through the rows, something unexpected happened. Despite the obvious disease and neglect, I began to notice signs of resilience. Some trees, particularly the older specimens in the center of the orchard, were showing new growth shoots that looked surprisingly vigorous. In a few scattered locations, I found trees that appeared relatively healthy despite being surrounded by sick neighbors. These anomalies caught my attention immediately. Why were these particular trees thriving when others nearby were failing? What was different about their location, their root systems, or their access to resources? I spent 3 hours walking the entire property, taking notes, photographing specific trees, and collecting soil samples from various locations. The orchard was situated on land with good drainage and a south-facing slope that would provide excellent sun exposure. The bones of a well-designed operation were still there beneath the neglect. Someone had planted this orchard with knowledge and care decades ago. The spacing between trees was optimal. The variety selection showed thoughtful planning for extended harvest seasons, and the layout took advantage of the natural topography. As the afternoon sun began to cast long shadows through the gnarled branches, I found myself standing in the oldest section of the orchard. These trees were clearly 50 or 60 years old, massive specimens with thick trunks and sprawling canopies. Many showed signs of disease, but their sheer size and presence spoke to decades of productivity and survival. I placed my hand on the rough bark of one particularly large tree and felt an unexpected emotional connection. This tree had fed families for generations. It had weathered storms, droughts, diseases, and neglect, yet it still stood, still pushed out leaves each spring, still attempted to bear fruit. That's when I made my decision. I would buy this orchard. I would take everything I'd learned in university and in my consulting work and pour it into this challenging, beautiful, broken piece of land. It would require all my savings, a substantial loan, and probably years of intensive work with no guarantee of success. My colleagues would think I was insane to abandon a lucrative consulting career for such a risky venture. But standing there among those ancient trees as the golden hour light filtered through their leaves, I felt more certain about this decision than I'd felt about anything in my professional life. The purchase process moved surprisingly quickly. The family selling the property was relieved to find a buyer who actually wanted to restore the orchard, rather than subdivide it for housing development. Within 6 weeks, I'd secured an agricultural loan, liquidated my retirement savings, and signed the papers that made me the owner of 35 acres of diseased apple trees. My parents thought I'd lost my mind. My father, a retired accountant, sat me down with spreadsheets showing how this investment made no financial sense compared to continuing my consulting career. My mother worried about me isolating myself in rural Oregon, away from the social and professional networks I'd built in Portland. "Your education opened doors for you," my mother said during one particularly difficult conversation. "You had opportunities most people only dream about. And now you're throwing it all away to become a farmer. There's no stability in that, Daniel. What happens if the trees die? What happens if you can't make it profitable? You'll have lost everything." I understood their concerns, but I also knew that I'd been losing something important in my consulting work. A sense of purpose and direct connection to the land I'd studied for so many years. The orchard represented a chance to test my theories, to build something meaningful with my own hands, and to prove that regenerative agriculture wasn't just academic theory, but practical reality. I moved into the small farmhouse on the property in early March, just as the trees were beginning to show their first spring growth. The house was in slightly better condition than the orchard, though it clearly needed work. It was a simple 2-bedroom structure built in the 1950s with original wood floors, a functional but outdated kitchen, and a front porch that overlooked the orchard rows. Previous owners had maintained it adequately, and it had good bones despite cosmetic wear. I spent my first few weeks settling in and creating a comprehensive assessment plan for the orchard restoration. My methodology was systematic and based on the principles I'd developed during my graduate research. First, I needed to understand the soil conditions throughout the property. I divided the orchard into sections and took detailed soil samples from each area, testing for pH, nutrient levels, organic matter content, compaction, and microbial activity. The results confirmed what I'd suspected. The soil was depleted and lifeless, showing minimal biological activity and severe imbalances in essential nutrients. Decades of conventional management with synthetic fertilizers and pesticides had destroyed the natural soil ecosystem that healthy trees require. Next, I conducted a tree-by-tree health assessment, documenting the condition of each specimen, noting disease symptoms, structural issues, and any signs of vigor or resilience. This process took nearly 3 weeks of intensive work, walking every row, examining every tree, and recording observations in a detailed database. What emerged from this assessment was a pattern that fascinated me. The healthiest trees weren't randomly distributed, but clustered in specific areas that seemed to correlate with slight variations in topography and, I suspected, differences in soil conditions or water availability. I also noticed something peculiar about the root zones of the healthiest trees. When I carefully excavated around the base of several vigorous specimens, I found that their root systems extended unusually far and showed signs of extensive mycorrhizal colonization, the beneficial fungi that form symbiotic relationships with tree roots, helping them access water and nutrients, were clearly more active in these locations. This observation became the foundation for my restoration strategy. Instead of treating the orchard as a collection of individual sick trees, I needed to think of it as an ecosystem where the underground network of roots and fungi was just as important as the visible trees above ground. My restoration plan was ambitious and unconventional. Rather than removing all the diseased trees immediately, I would work to regenerate the soil ecosystem first, creating conditions where the tree's natural defenses could recover. I began by planting cover crops between the rows, carefully selected species that would add nitrogen to the soil, break up compaction with deep roots, attract beneficial insects, and provide organic matter when I mowed them down. I chose a mixture of crimson clover, hairy vetch, daikon radish, and buckwheat, each serving specific functions in soil regeneration. I also started making my own compost and compost tea, using materials I could source locally. A nearby brewery provided spent grain. A coffee roaster gave me their used grounds, and I connected with several restaurants that were happy to have someone haul away their food scraps. I built large compost bins and began the process of creating the rich, biologically active material that would feed the soil microorganisms. Every few weeks, I would brew batches of compost tea, aerating the mixture to multiply beneficial bacteria and fungi, then applying it directly to the soil around each tree. The physical work was exhausting. I woke at dawn and worked until darkness fell, pruning diseased branches, repairing the irrigation system section by section, applying compost and monitoring the trees for changes. My hands developed calluses, my back ached constantly, and I fell into bed each night too tired to do anything but sleep. But there was something deeply satisfying about the direct relationship between effort and results. When I pruned a tree properly, I could see how the remaining branches received better light and air circulation. When I improved the soil around a struggling tree, I could observe new growth emerging within weeks. 3 months into the restoration work, I began to see encouraging signs. The cover crops had grown thick and lush, transforming the bare, compacted ground between tree rows into a carpet of green. When I dug into the soil now, it was noticeably softer, easier to work, and teeming with earthworms and other beneficial organisms. Some of the trees that had appeared nearly dead were pushing out new shoots, showing that they still had life in their root systems, despite the damage visible above ground. The irrigation repairs meant that trees were receiving consistent water for the first time in years, and I could see the difference in their foliage, which was darker green and more vigorous. But I also faced setbacks and challenges that tested my commitment and knowledge. A late spring frost damaged many of the blossoms, reducing what little fruit crop the trees might have produced. I discovered that several trees had root systems so damaged by disease that they were beyond saving and needed to be removed entirely. The financial pressure was constant. I'd budgeted carefully, but expenses always seemed to exceed my projections. Equipment broke down, materials cost more than expected, and there was no income yet from fruit sales to offset the mounting costs. During this challenging period, Dr. Hartwell visited regularly, offering encouragement and occasionally helping with specific tasks. She brought other agricultural professionals to see what I was doing, and some of them were impressed by the systematic approach and the early signs of recovery. Others remained skeptical, pointing out that soil regeneration was a long-term process and that many of the trees were too far gone to save. "You're fighting biology," one visiting consultant told me. "These trees have advanced disease. You can improve the soil all you want, but if the trees themselves are infected, they're going to die regardless." His words haunted me, especially during moments of doubt when I wondered if I'd made a terrible mistake. I'd invested everything I had into this project, and if it failed, I would be financially ruined and professionally embarrassed. Late at night, alone in the farmhouse, I sometimes questioned whether my idealistic vision of regenerative agriculture was realistic, or if I was simply being stubborn and naive about the harsh realities of commercial farming. But then I would walk through the orchard early in the morning when the dew was still heavy on the leaves and the air was cool and fresh, and I would see the small signs of progress that kept me going. A tree that had been bare and lifeless a month ago now had leaves unfurling. A section of the orchard where I'd focused intensive soil work showed trees with noticeably improved vigor. The cover crops were attracting beneficial insects, pollinators that would be essential when the trees bloomed again. These small victories reminded me why I'd taken this risk and renewed my determination to see the project through. Before we continue with the next part of this story, I'd love to invite you to subscribe to this channel if you're finding value in these real-life stories about perseverance, restoration, and unexpected discoveries. Hit that subscribe button and the notification bell so you don't miss future episodes. And I'm curious, have you ever taken a risk on something that others thought was impossible? Maybe you started a business, changed careers, or took on a project that seemed overwhelming. Share your experience in the comments below. I read every single one, and I love hearing about the bold decisions that have shaped your lives. Your story might inspire someone else who's standing at their own crossroads right now. As summer arrived, the orchard transformed in ways that exceeded my most optimistic expectations. The cover crops had done their work, and when I mowed them down, they created a thick mulch that retained moisture and fed the soil as they decomposed. The trees responded with a flush of growth that was remarkable considering their condition just months earlier. New branches emerged from trunks that had seemed dormant. Leaves grew larger and healthier, and even some of the most compromised trees showed signs of recovery. I began to feel that my approach was working, that the foundation I was building underground was supporting regeneration above ground. During this period, I hired my first employee, a young woman named Sarah Chen, who had just graduated with a degree in environmental science and was passionate about sustainable agriculture. She'd heard about my orchard restoration project through Dr. Hartwell and reached out asking if I needed help. I couldn't really afford to pay much, but Sarah was more interested in the learning experience than the salary. She brought fresh energy and ideas to the work, and having someone to share the physical labor and problem-solving made an enormous difference in both productivity and morale. Sarah was particularly interested in the biological aspects of soil health. She set up experiments to monitor microbial populations in different sections of the orchard, tracking how our interventions affected the underground ecosystem. We would spend evenings analyzing data, comparing notes, and discussing what we were observing. Her enthusiasm reminded me of my own graduate school days, when everything about plant biology seemed fascinating and full of potential. Together we refined our approach, making adjustments based on what the trees were telling us through their growth patterns and health indicators. One afternoon in late July, Sarah and I were working in the oldest section of the orchard, the area with the massive 60-year-old trees that had captivated me during my first visit. We were carefully excavating around the base of one particularly large specimen, trying to understand why this tree remained relatively healthy while many around it were struggling. As we dug deeper, exposing more of the root system, Sarah suddenly stopped and called me over. "Daniel, look at this. I think you need to see what we found here." I knelt beside her and looked into the excavation. What I saw made my heart race with excitement and curiosity. The root system we'd exposed was extraordinarily extensive and complex, but that wasn't what had caught Sarah's attention. Woven throughout the roots was a dense network of fungal mycelia, the thread-like structures that form the body of fungi. This wasn't unusual in itself. Mycorrhizal fungi are common in healthy orchards, but the pattern and density were remarkable, creating an almost artistic latticework around and between the roots. More striking was something we noticed as we carefully brushed away more soil. The fungal network seemed to extend outward from this tree toward neighboring trees, creating visible connections between root systems. We spent the rest of that day and most of the next carefully excavating and documenting what we'd discovered. The root system of this central tree acted as a hub, connected through fungal networks to at least a dozen surrounding trees. Some of these neighboring trees were showing better health than others farther away, and we began to hypothesize that this old tree, which had survived decades and developed extensive fungal relationships, might be sharing resources with younger or weaker trees through the underground network. This phenomenon, sometimes called the wood wide web by researchers, had been documented in forests but was less studied in agricultural settings. As we continued our careful excavation work over the following weeks, we made an even more startling discovery. Deep in the root zone, about 3 feet below the surface, Sarah's trowel struck something that wasn't wood, root, or stone. We carefully brushed away the soil to reveal a small metal object, tarnished with age, but still intact. It was a pendant or medallion of some kind, roughly circular, about 2 inches in diameter. The design on its surface was still visible despite decades in the ground. It showed a tree with extensive roots reaching downward, mirroring the branches that reached upward, creating a symmetrical pattern. Around the edge were words in a language I didn't immediately recognize. We carefully removed the pendant and took it to the farmhouse to clean and examine it more closely. After gentle washing, the design became clearer. The tree depicted wasn't just any tree, it was specifically an apple tree, identifiable by the small, round fruits shown among the branches. The roots and branches formed an almost perfect circle, suggesting continuity, cycles, or eternal return. The inscription around the edge, after some research, we determined to be Latin. It read, "Spes Eterna in Radicibus," which translated to "Eternal hope lies in the roots." I was fascinated by this discovery and wanted to understand its origin and significance. I began researching the history of the property, visiting the County Historical Society, and tracking down records about previous owners. What I learned added profound depth to my restoration work. The orchard had been planted in 1962 by a man named Thomas Whitmore, a horticulturist who had immigrated to Oregon from England after World War II. Thomas had survived terrible experiences during the war and came to America seeking a fresh start and a way to heal from trauma he never fully discussed with others. According to historical records and conversations with elderly neighbors who remembered him, Thomas had approached orcharding with an almost spiritual dedication. He believed that growing food, nurturing trees, and working with soil were acts of hope and healing. He'd planted these trees during a period when he was struggling with what we would now call PTSD, and the orchard became his therapy and his purpose. The pendant I'd found was apparently something he'd buried beneath the first tree he planted, the massive specimen that Sarah and I had been studying as a kind of talisman or prayer for the success of his endeavor. Thomas had run the orchard successfully for over 30 years before his health declined. After his death in the mid-1990s, his children, who had no interest in farming, had hired managers to run the operation. But without Thomas's dedication and knowledge, the orchard gradually declined. Eventually, the family had tried to sell it, leading to nearly a decade of neglect before I purchased it. Learning this history gave me a renewed sense of purpose. I wasn't just restoring an orchard. I was honoring the vision and hope of a man who had planted these trees as an act of faith in the future. The pendant also helped me understand what I'd been observing in the root systems. Thomas, educated in traditional European horticulture, would have understood the importance of soil biology and mycorrhizal relationships long before these concepts became trendy in sustainable agriculture. He'd likely planted this central tree with special care, perhaps inoculating it with beneficial fungi, and positioned it intentionally as a mother tree that would support the entire orchard through underground connections. His knowledge had created a living system that persisted even through years of neglect and poor management. I had the pendant cleaned and preserved, and I hung it in the farmhouse where I could see it daily. It became a symbol of what I was trying to accomplish, a reminder that hope and regeneration are possible even after devastation, that the roots, the unseen foundation, are where true strength and resilience reside. The inscription, "Eternal hope lies in the roots," took on multiple meanings. It referred literally to the root systems that sustained the trees, but also metaphorically to the importance of foundations, history, and the patience required to nurture growth. As autumn approached, the orchard continued to improve. I'd managed to harvest a small crop of apples, not nearly enough for commercial sales, but enough to test quality and to make cider for local farmers' markets. The fruit was better than I'd expected given the tree's condition, and people who tasted it commented on its complex flavor, suggesting that the old varieties Thomas had planted were special. I began to see a possible path to profitability, not through mass production of commodity fruit, but through specialty varieties and value-added products marketed to consumers who appreciated quality and story. Sarah and I continued our monitoring and research, documenting the orchard's recovery with photographs, measurements, and soil tests. The data showed consistent improvement across nearly every metric. Soil organic matter was increasing, microbial diversity was expanding, and tree health indicators were trending positive. We even attracted attention from the university, and Dr. Hartwell brought graduate students to study what we were doing. The orchard was becoming a demonstration site for regenerative agriculture principles, showing that severely damaged systems could recover with the right interventions. But not everything was smooth progress. I was running through my financial reserves faster than planned, and the small income from my first harvest barely made a dent in mounting expenses. I'd taken on additional debt to purchase equipment and materials, and the pressure of financial obligations weighed on me constantly. There were moments when I wondered if I could sustain the operation long enough to see it become truly profitable. I was committed to the work, but commitment alone doesn't pay bills or satisfy loan payments. During this stressful period, I received unexpected support from the local farming community. Neighbors who'd watched my efforts with initial skepticism began to recognize that I was serious and knowledgeable. An older farmer named Robert Morrison, who ran a successful cherry orchard nearby, stopped by one afternoon and offered to share equipment with me, reducing my need to purchase everything myself. A woman named Linda Garcia, who operated an organic vegetable farm, introduced me to her network of restaurants and markets, helping me establish sales connections for future harvests. These relationships reminded me that farming isn't just about the relationship between humans and land, it's also about community and mutual support. The isolation I'd felt during the early months began to ease as I became part of a network of growers who understood the challenges and rewards of agricultural work. We would share knowledge, equipment, labor during harvest times, and encouragement during difficult periods. This community became as important to my success as my technical knowledge or financial resources. Winter brought a necessary pause in the intensive physical work, giving me time to reflect on what I'd learned and to plan for the coming year. I spent long evenings in the farmhouse, analyzing data, reading research papers, and developing a more sophisticated management plan based on my first season's observations. The pendant I'd discovered remained on the wall above my desk, a constant reminder of Thomas Whitmore's vision and the living legacy he'd created. I found myself thinking often about his story, about how he'd used agriculture as a path to healing, and how that same process was working in my own life in ways I hadn't fully anticipated. My consulting work in Portland had been intellectually satisfying, but emotionally empty. I'd been surrounded by people yet felt isolated, successful by conventional measures yet unfulfilled. The orchard, despite its challenges and uncertainties, had given me something I hadn't realized I was missing, a sense of purpose rooted in something larger than myself. Each day brought tangible work that connected me to natural cycles, to history, and to a future I was actively building. The trees didn't care about my credentials or career trajectory. They responded only to the quality of care I provided, and there was something refreshingly honest about that relationship. Sarah had returned to university for the winter semester, but planned to come back in the spring. Before leaving, we'd developed a research proposal to study the mycorrhizal networks in the orchard more systematically, potentially turning the property into a field site for ongoing academic research. This collaboration would bring additional resources and knowledge to the restoration work, while contributing to scientific understanding of how these underground networks function in agricultural settings. The proposal was accepted by the university's agricultural department, along with a small grant that would help offset some of my operational costs. In January, I received a letter from Thomas Whitmore's daughter, Eleanor, who was now in her late 60s and living in Seattle. She'd heard through the local community about my purchase and restoration of her father's orchard, and she wanted to visit. I immediately wrote back inviting her to come when weather permitted, curious to learn more about the man whose vision I was working to honor. Eleanor arrived on a surprisingly mild day in late February, just as the trees were beginning to show the first subtle signs of spring awakening. Walking through the orchard with Eleanor was an emotional experience for both of us. She hadn't visited the property in over 15 years, having found it too painful to see the decline after her father's death. Now, seeing the signs of recovery and renewal, she was moved to tears. "My father poured his heart into this place," she said as we stood near the central tree where I'd found the pendant. "After the war, he was broken in ways that our family didn't fully understand at the time. We didn't have the language for trauma and PTSD that we have now. He just seemed haunted and distant. But when he started working with these trees, something in him began to heal." Eleanor shared stories about her father that gave me deeper insight into his philosophy and methods. Thomas had been a medic during the war, witnessing horrific casualties and feeling helpless to prevent suffering. When he came to Oregon, he was searching for a way to create life rather than merely tend to death and destruction. He studied everything he could about soil biology, plant health, and sustainable practices, approaching orcharding with scientific rigor combined with an almost reverent respect for natural systems. He believed that healthy soil created healthy trees, which produced healthy fruit, which nourished healthy communities, and that this cycle of nurturing and growth was essential to human well-being. The pendant I'd found, Eleanor explained, had belonged to Thomas's mother, who had given it to him before he left for the war. The tree design and Latin inscription were from her family's tradition, passed down through generations of farmers in rural England. His mother had told him that no matter what destruction he witnessed, he should remember that hope survives in the roots, in the foundations, in the things we cannot see but which sustain life. When Thomas planted his orchard, burying the pendant beneath the first tree was his way of honoring his mother's wisdom and planting his own hope for healing and renewal. Eleanor was amazed when I showed her the documentation of the mycorrhizal networks connecting the trees, explaining how her father's central tree had indeed become a mother tree, supporting the entire orchard. "He would have loved knowing this," she said with a sad smile. "He always talked about the trees being a family, taking care of each other underground in ways we couldn't see. People thought he was just being poetic, but he was describing something real that science is only now beginning to fully understand." Before she left, Eleanor gave me several of her father's old notebooks, journals where he'd recorded his observations, methods, and philosophy. These documents became treasured resources, offering insights that complemented my modern scientific knowledge with practical wisdom earned through decades of attentive observation. Spring brought renewed activity and continued evidence of the orchard's recovery. The trees bloomed more abundantly than they had in years, creating a spectacular display of white and pink blossoms that attracted pollinators in impressive numbers. The cover crops I'd planted the previous fall had overwintered successfully and were now providing early-season pollen and nectar for beneficial insects. Sarah returned from university energized and ready to implement our research protocols, and we hired 2 additional part-time workers to help with the increasing workload as the orchard demanded more intensive management. The research project attracted attention beyond the local community. A regional newspaper ran a feature story about the orchard restoration, focusing on the discovery of Thomas Whitmore's pendant and the connection between his post-war healing and my modern regenerative agriculture work. The article resonated with readers, and I began receiving emails and calls from people who were interested in what we were doing. Some were farmers curious about our methods, others were consumers wanting to buy our fruit, and surprisingly, several were veterans or people dealing with trauma who connected with Thomas's story and asked if they could volunteer at the orchard. This last group led to an unexpected development that would transform the orchard's mission beyond just agricultural production. I started a small volunteer program, inviting people who were struggling with various challenges, veterans with PTSD, individuals recovering from addiction, people dealing with anxiety and depression, to come work in the orchard as a form of therapy and healing. We would spend time together pruning trees, improving soil, monitoring plant health, and discussing how these agricultural practices mirrored processes of human recovery and growth. The work provided structure, purpose, physical activity, and connection to natural cycles, all elements that participants found helpful in their healing journeys. The therapeutic dimension of the orchard work enriched my own experience in unexpected ways. I'd started this project focused primarily on the agricultural and scientific challenges of restoration, but I was discovering that the deeper value lay in what the process represented and what it offered to people seeking meaning and healing. Thomas Whitmore had understood this intuitively, and now, decades later, his orchard was serving the same purpose for a new generation. The pendant's inscription, "Eternal hope lies in the roots," took on yet another layer of meaning, referring not just to tree roots or historical roots, but to the fundamental human capacity for regeneration and renewal. By midsummer, the orchard was producing its first substantial crop since I'd purchased it. The fruit quality was exceptional, with complex flavors that reflected the diversity of old varieties Thomas had planted and the improved soil health we'd been building. I established relationships with high-end restaurants in Portland and Eugene that were willing to pay premium prices for specialty apples with a compelling story. I also expanded the cider operation, partnering with a local cidery to create a signature product using only our fruit, marketed with Thomas's story and the symbolism of the pendant. The financial picture was finally improving. I wasn't making a fortune, but income was beginning to exceed expenses, and I could see a path to sustainable profitability. More importantly, the orchard had become something larger than a business. It was a community gathering place, a research site, a therapeutic space, and a living memorial to one man's vision of healing through agriculture. The trees that had seemed beyond saving 2 years earlier were now thriving, their recovery a testament to the power of patient, knowledgeable care and faith in natural regeneration processes. Dr. Hartwell visited regularly and was clearly proud of what I'd accomplished. During one visit, she brought a group of her current graduate students to tour the orchard and learn about the restoration process. As I led them through the rows, explaining our methods and showing them the results, I realized how much I'd grown professionally and personally since making the decision to leave consulting. I was no longer just applying theories developed by others. I was creating new knowledge through direct engagement with complex living systems, contributing to both scientific understanding and practical demonstrations of regenerative agriculture's potential. The volunteers who worked in the orchard were also thriving in their own ways. Several reported significant improvements in their mental health, with some crediting the orchard work as a crucial element in their recovery from trauma or addiction. We'd created an informal support community, with people forming friendships and helping each other through difficult times. The orchard provided not just agricultural products, but also social and therapeutic benefits that rippled outward into people's lives and relationships. As the 3rd year of orchard ownership began, I found myself reflecting on the journey that had brought me to this point and marveling at how completely my life had transformed. The scared, uncertain agronomist who had first walked these rows, wondering if he'd made a catastrophic mistake, had evolved into someone confident, grounded, and deeply connected to both the land and the community that had formed around it. The orchard had taught me lessons that extended far beyond agricultural science, lessons about patience, resilience, faith in unseen processes, and the profound interconnection between human well-being and ecological health. The research collaboration with the university had produced fascinating results that were gaining attention in academic circles. Sarah, now working on her master's thesis using data from the orchard, had documented how the mycorrhizal networks we'd been nurturing were not only supporting tree health, but also increasing the orchard's resilience to stress. During a particularly severe drought the previous summer, trees connected to the extensive fungal networks had maintained better health and productivity than isolated trees, suggesting that the underground sharing of water and nutrients was a crucial survival strategy. Her research was challenging conventional orchard management wisdom and providing scientific validation for the regenerative approaches we'd been implementing. The therapeutic volunteer program had also evolved and formalized. I'd partnered with local mental health organizations to create a structured program with regular sessions, trained facilitators, and outcome measurements. The results were remarkable. Participants showed measurable improvements in depression and anxiety symptoms, increased sense of purpose, and better social connection. Several volunteers had become so committed to the work that they'd transitioned into paid part-time positions, creating a pipeline from healing participation to meaningful employment. The orchard was demonstrating that agriculture could be more than just food production. It could be a vehicle for community health and individual transformation. One spring morning, I received a call from a documentary filmmaker who wanted to create a short film about the orchard restoration, focusing on the connection between Thomas Whitmore's post-war healing and the modern therapeutic program. I was initially hesitant about the attention, preferring to focus on the work rather than publicity. But I recognized that sharing the story might inspire others to see agriculture differently, to understand that farms and orchards could be spaces of healing and regeneration for both land and people. I agreed to the project, and over the following months, the filmmaker captured the orchard through seasons, interviewing volunteers, documenting the work, and telling Thomas's story alongside my own. The documentary premiered at a regional film festival and received an overwhelmingly positive response. It led to more media attention, speaking invitations, and inquiries from people wanting to start similar programs in their communities. I found myself becoming an unexpected advocate for a vision of agriculture that integrated ecological restoration, mental health, and community building. The orchard that I'd purchased as a personal challenge and scientific experiment was becoming a model for others who saw potential in combining sustainable farming with social purpose. Eleanor Whitmore became a regular visitor and an important supporter of the work. She was deeply moved by how her father's vision had been honored and extended in ways he couldn't have imagined. She established a small foundation in Thomas's name to support similar projects, using proceeds from the sale of other family assets to fund grants for farmers integrating therapeutic programs with regenerative agriculture. Her father's legacy was expanding beyond the boundaries of our 35 acres, inspiring a movement that connected ecological healing with human healing. The orchard's profitability continued to improve as we refined our production and marketing strategies. The premium apples and cider generated solid revenue, but we also added value through agritourism, offering seasonal events, educational workshops, and therapeutic programs that people paid to attend. The diversified income streams created financial stability while keeping us connected to our core mission. I was able to hire more staff, including a full-time orchard manager, which freed me to focus more on program development, research collaboration, and speaking engagements that spread the orchard's message. In the 4th year, I made a pilgrimage of sorts to England, tracking down Thomas Whitmore's ancestral village and meeting distant relatives who still farmed in the area. They were amazed to learn about Thomas's orchard in Oregon and how his mother's pendant had been discovered and had become a symbol for regenerative work happening decades after his death. Walking through the English countryside, where Thomas's agricultural philosophy had been shaped, I felt a profound connection across time and distance to the man whose vision I'd inherited and was working to honor and extend. The old farmers in England shared wisdom that echoed what I'd learned from Thomas's notebooks and from my own experience. They talked about farming as a calling rather than just an occupation, about the responsibility of caring for land that would outlast any individual life, and about the spiritual dimension of working with soil and seasons. Their perspective helped me articulate something I'd been feeling but hadn't fully expressed. That the orchard work was fundamentally about participating in cycles of death and regeneration, decay and renewal that mirrored the deepest patterns of existence itself. Returning to Oregon, I felt a renewed commitment to the work and a clearer vision for the orchard's future. I wanted to ensure that what we'd built would continue beyond my own tenure, just as Thomas's work had continued beyond his. I began developing a succession plan that would eventually transition the orchard to a non-profit structure, ensuring that it would remain dedicated to its integrated mission of agricultural production, ecological restoration, research, and therapeutic programming. The land and the vision would belong not to any individual, but to the community that had formed around it and the larger mission it represented. 5 years after purchasing the orchard, I organized a celebration to mark the anniversary and to honor Thomas Whitmore's memory. Eleanor attended, along with Dr. Hartwell, Sarah, who had completed her master's degree and was now pursuing a PhD using the orchard as a primary research site. Current and former volunteers, community supporters, and agricultural colleagues from across the region. We gathered in the oldest section of the orchard, near the mother tree where the pendant had been buried and where the most extensive mycorrhizal networks connected the living community of trees. During the celebration, I shared the pendant's inscription and reflected on what we'd learned about hope residing in roots. The roots of trees, reaching deep into soil and connecting through fungal networks to support life above ground. The roots of history, Thomas's vision continuing to bear fruit decades after his death. The roots of community, people connecting with each other and with the land in ways that nourished both. And the roots of personal identity, the foundation of values and purpose that sustains us through challenges and changes. All of these meanings were present in the orchard, making it a living symbol of regeneration and hope. The trees that had been diseased and dying when I first arrived were now healthy and productive, their recovery a testament to the power of patient, knowledgeable care and faith in natural healing processes. The soil that had been depleted and lifeless was now rich with organic matter and teeming with beneficial organisms. The property that had been abandoned and neglected was now a thriving center of activity, production, research, and healing. The transformation was remarkable, but it hadn't happened quickly or easily. It had required years of sustained effort, willingness to learn from failures, and trust in processes that couldn't be rushed. As I looked around at the people gathered among the trees, at the healthy foliage and developing fruit, at the visible and invisible networks that sustained the whole system, I felt profound gratitude for the journey that had brought me here. The decision to buy a sick orchard had seemed risky and possibly foolish to many people, including sometimes to myself. But it had led to a life of meaning and purpose that I couldn't have found any other way. The orchard had given me far more than I'd given it, teaching me about resilience, patience, interconnection, and the eternal hope that lies in roots, in foundations, in the unseen processes that sustain all life and growth. Thank you so much for listening to this story. If you found meaning in Daniel's journey from uncertain agronomist to orchard steward and community builder, I'd be truly grateful if you'd subscribe to this channel. These stories matter because they remind us that transformation is possible, that taking risks on what we believe in can lead to profound fulfillment, and that hope really does reside in the roots, the foundations we build even when we can't yet see the fruits they'll bear. I'd love to hear from you in the comments. Have you ever discovered something unexpected that changed your understanding of a situation or gave you hope? Maybe you found an old letter, uncovered a family story, or stumbled upon evidence of resilience you didn't know existed. Share your experience with our community. Your story might be exactly what someone else needs to hear today. And here's a question to reflect on. What did you learn from this story about patience, healing, or the unseen connections that sustain us? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. I read every single one, and I'm continually inspired by the wisdom and insights this community shares. Until next time, remember that even in the most broken and neglected places, the roots of hope remain, waiting for someone to nurture them back to life.